Hi, this is Kim Eierman, founder of EcoBeneficial, with more useful gardening tips to help improve our environment. Today I have the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. Roger Koide. He is professor of biology at Brigham Young University, used to be at Penn State. And Roger has been doing research on a topic that'll be of interest to gardeners and landscape professionals alike. Something that's really important underground, and as landscapers and gardeners, we often forget about the importance of things that are in our soil. Roger happens to be an expert on mycorrhizal fungi. In fact, he's been researching this topic since 1985, so about 28 years. So I'll turn this over to Roger, and Roger, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome, Kim. Thanks.
Could you give us a layman's explanation or definition of mycorrhizal fungi, please?
Sure, I can try. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that form an intimate relationship with plants. They colonize their roots, and in the process obtain carbohydrates from the roots, sugars from the plants. But they also will provide some benefit to the plants as well, usually in the form of mineral nutrients. Phosphate is one of the things that they can scavenge from the soil and transport to the plant, for example. So plants that are mycorrhizal often grow faster and bigger as a consequence of this enhanced uptake of phosphorus from the soil.
And I've heard you state that about 75% to 80% of all terrestrial plants actually are mycorrhizal in nature. They have an associated fungi.
Yeah, that's right. The vast majority of terrestrial plants are colonized by the mycorrhizal fungi. There are various types of mycorrhizal fungi. There's not just one kind, and different kinds of plants are colonized by different kinds of fungi, but they function in pretty much the same way. As you imply there are a minority of species that do not form mycorrhizal relationships. These are things like mustards and certain plants in the Chenopodiaceae. That's the family that has the spinach plant in it, and a few others like that.
Mm-hmm. And talk a little bit about the primary types. People may have heard of Ecto and Endo Mycorrhizae, but you've actually got kind of a correction on that. I wonder if you could explain.
Well, okay. Ectomycorrhizaes. So the contrast between Ectomycorrhizae and Endomycorrhizae was made a long time ago, because when people looked at the way the fungi colonized the root, there were two modes of colonization. In one, the Ectomycorrhizae, the fungi colonize the root and they actually grow into the root, but they don't grow into the cells of the root. They stayed on the outside, and that's why we called them Ectomycorrhizae. We still refer to those as Ectomycorrhizaes. The endomycorrhizal fungi, on the other hand, they grow into the root, but also they grow into and within individual cells of the root. And so those became known as the endomycorrhizal fungi. We don't use that term very much anymore. And among the endomycorrhizal fungi, probably the most common in nature is what we call the vesicular arbuscular, or the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus.
And you mentioned that that term arbuscular references the shape of a tree.
Yeah, so these fungi will produce little structures inside the cells of the root, and some of these are shaped like little bushes or little trees because they're highly branched, and that's why they were named arbuscules.
Okay. And you also made a comment, excuse me, that I thought was important, that we often refer to mycorrhiza, but really the appropriate terminology is mycorrhizal fungi because it's an association. Talk a little bit about why that's so important.
Yeah, so the fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi, are like any other organisms. They are entities unto themselves. The symbiosis, the intimate association between the fungus and the plant, is called the mycorrhiza. That word, mycorrhiza, actually is derived from two different roots, myco meaning fungus and rhiza meaning root. So the mycorrhiza is this symbiosis between the two different organisms. The fungi have, I'm going to put this in a colloquial way, they have minds of their own, and plants have minds of their own. That is, they're all driven by natural selection to maximize their own interests, but in the symbiosis, they work together to help each other.
Okay. And something else that I recall you saying is that the symbiosis can be mutual and positive, but it doesn't have to be mutualistic.
Yeah, so people have in their minds that symbioses are fixed in their natures. In other words, if we say the mycorrhiza is a beneficial symbiosis, then people want to believe that it's always beneficial. But in fact, the nature of the symbiosis can vary through time. Perhaps when the fungus first colonizes the root, maybe it's not all that beneficial to the plant. It could be just beneficial to itself. And so the nature of the symbiosis, whether it's positive or negative or neutral, may change with time, with circumstances, depending on how dry the soil is or how much phosphate we might find in the soil, etc.
So can you give us an example of when it might be a kind of a negative symbiosis?
Well, some people think that the likelihood for a negative impact of the fungus on the plant is pretty minimal, because we do know that the fungi can be kept at bay to a certain degree. In other words, the plants, under circumstances when the plant won't benefit much from the symbiosis, they can actually minimize colonization by the fungus. If you do that, if the plant is capable of doing that, it may be able to reduce the likelihood of having a negative interaction with the fungus.
So as gardeners and as landscapers are basically concerned with mycorrhizal fungi is to help plants, increase their nutrient uptake, correct?
That's right. It could also, in some cases, the ectomycorrhizas also enhance water uptake from the soil, and that may be very important in the life of a little tiny tree seedling where the roots are not very developed. Unless they're mycorrhizal, in some cases, they will easily dry out, and they may depend quite a bit on the mycorrhizal fungi for water uptake.
And Roger, could you give us some examples of plants that are arbuscular in their mycorrhizal association?
Yeah, so most of the herbaceous plants, if they're going to be mycorrhizal, are going to be arbuscular mycorrhizal. And so things like in the garden, everything except things in the mustard family, or things in the goosefoot family, or the pink family are going to be arbuscular mycorrhizal. Even some of the trees in our landscapes will be arbuscular mycorrhizal, the maples, things in the rose family like cherries and those kinds of things. Tulip poplars are arbuscular mycorrhizal. But most of the other kinds of trees, oaks and pines and spruces and those kinds of things, they will be ectomycorrhizal.
Okay. And I've heard some scientists speak about the native mycorrhizal fungi being really critical, that introducing mycorrhizal fungi from elsewhere can sometimes be, kind of an exercise in futility. Talk a little bit about that, if you would, and your opinions on that.
Yeah, it could. There's two reasons to consider this. One is that very often the native fungi, of course, are going to be adapted to the site. That is, if it's very dry in the summer, very wet in the fall, or something like this, then those fungi are going to probably be adapted to that sort of situation. If you have fungi coming from a different kind of environment, then they may be poorly adapted, and as a consequence, they may be outcompeted by the native fungi anyway. So their utility will be very, very low. Another consideration is the fact that we don't really know, when we introduce something that's not native to the site, whether it's going to have a potentially ill effect on the native mycoflora. So if you have something coming from a different climate, if it were particularly competitive, it's possible that it could outcompete some of the native fungi.
So lots of folks will have seen mycorrhizal products for sale either online or at retailers. This has gotten to be kind of a popular thing to sell. And you had some opinions about the resellers and the products. Share some of those thoughts with us.
Well, as far as I know, there are not very many actual manufacturers of the product. There are a lot of people who will resell products that are packaged, in various ways. Some of the manufacturers are completely legitimate and they make good quality product, but there's no, as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, there are no industry standards that can assure a retail customer of the quality. So when we go to a nursery and buy a product, it's difficult to know whether it's going to be effective. There have been many cases in which people buy a product only to discover that it's got so little live product in it as to be completely useless in terms of inoculating mycorrhizal fungi. Many of the products do, however, contain doses of fertilizer, and so the consumer may see a growth effect and be happy with it, but in the end, it's really just very, very expensive fertilizer.
So, do you have any thoughts about particular products that are out there that would even be worth considering, or?
Well, I can't endorse one product over another, but there are in the experience of a homeowner, for example, there are probably very few circumstances where retail products are going to be really of any utility.
Okay.
There are some circumstances where topsoil has been stripped away, and I guess there are some neighborhoods like that where topsoil is stripped away. And in that circumstance, I suppose inoculating the soil or your beds where you're going to grow particular plants might be worthwhile. But there, I wouldn't bother spending money on a retail product because, again, we don't know the quality of the material. One thing you could do is you could bring small quantities of soil from a location where you have healthy plants growing already. If there's no disease there, then moving that soil would also help to colonize your plants with mycorrhizal fungi.
That's a great suggestion, and you also commented that that tilling of the soil can be super detrimental to mycorrhizal fungi. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, most people want to prepare a really nice seed bed if they're growing vegetables or this kind of thing, and very frequently people will be real happy to rototill their soil. In the process of rototilling, if the soil is just right, you can really get it crumbled up nicely and prepare a very nice seed bed. But in the process of doing so, you're going to be destroying a lot of the natural inoculum potential of these fungi, because a lot of what is going to colonize your new roots will be the hyphae, the little tiny strands, thread-like strands growing in the soil. And when you rototill that soil, you'll destroy them and cause them to die. There will be some spores in the soil that will survive that, so you're not going to completely eliminate the mycorrhizal fungi, but you'll certainly set them back by rototilling. A lot of home gardeners, vegetable gardeners, it might be recommended that they plant a cover crop over the winter if they live in the northeast where the soil will freeze. Plant a cover crop, and the cover crop in the fall, if it's mycorrhizal, in the fall will be colonized by the mycorrhizal fungi, and then in the spring the fungi will grow from that cover crop and give it a head start, so that when you do plant your vegetables, they'll be well colonized, rapidly colonized.
And if you have a very degraded landscape, potentially in a new development particularly, or just a landscape that suffered a lot of erosion, etc., how long might it take you to colonize a new area if you use the approach that you suggested of finding a remnant area with healthy soil and introducing that soil? How long might that take?
Well, if the inoculum is good, you'll get some colonization. Even if the neighborhood they took it all the way down to the subsoil. If you inoculate your soil with soil that has live mycorrhizal fungi in it, you'll have colonization that very year. And this sort of depends. This approach or the probability of getting good colonization in your subsoil or whatever it is in your new house is going to depend somewhat on the kind of mycorrhizal fungi we're talking about. So, for example, the ectomycorrhizal fungi, these are those that usually produce mushrooms and that kind of fruiting body. Those spores are very small and are borne on the wind, so those can colonize fairly rapidly. But arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, their spores are quite a bit larger and are not borne on the wind. They'll only move in soil, so they will colonize very, very slowly unless you do something to promote that.
Now, a lot of folks probably don't realize how much fungal activity is going on in our soils, and you've shown an example of fairy rings, and I also think of one of my favorites, dog vomit fungus, which I found on my lawn and thought I had a rabid raccoon. But talk a little bit about the evidence that fungi is there and kind of what that means.
Yeah, sometimes when homeowners see fungi growing in their lawns, they're really alarmed and they think, oh my, I have some strange disease. But fungi, in fact, are everywhere, and most of them are completely, well, they don't cause disease, and in fact, they're very, very important for nutrient cycling. So a lot of nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, get locked up in biological materials, leaves, and so forth. And unless those materials are released and turned back into minerals from their organic forms in the tissues, then the plants don't have access to them. So the fungi are essential in a process we call nutrient cycling, releasing those nutrients from the litter, the organic material that falls in the fall, and all the rest of that. So they're very, very important. And most of the things we see in our lawns, like shaggy manes and all those little mushrooms that grow, they're not disease-causing, they're actually essential.
So they're actually probably an indicator that something good is happening in your soil.
Yeah, in fact, people will sometimes apply fungicides to their soil when they see fairy rings and this kind of thing, and that's probably going way overboard. Fungicides tend to be very, very dangerous and much more likely to harm humans and pets than some other pesticides are, like herbicides. Most herbicides are fairly safe, but most fungicides are not very safe at all. So I wouldn't do that.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. And do you have any idea why that is?
Well, I think it's because I'm not an expert in this area, but the fungal physiology in many ways is more similar to animal physiology than to plant physiology. Fungi are not animals and they're not plants, but in some ways they're more animal-like than they are plant-like. So some of the pesticides used against fungi are going to have more harmful effects against animals than they do against plants.
Thank you. That's actually pretty fascinating. So listeners, beware of fungicides in particular. Now, there are obviously some plants that don't have a mycorrhizal association. Can you share some of those with us and, kind of how do they get by?
Well, as I said earlier, there are some families that seem to be more prone than others to being non-mycorrhizal. The mustard family is one of them. The pink family. What am I thinking of? That's the
Silenes and
yeah, those genera, the carnations and those.
Okay.
What family is that? I can't remember. Anyway, those and then the Chenopodiaceae, the goosefoot family. There are not too many people who use those in their landscapes. But anyway, there are a few lineages like that that tend to be non-mycorrhizal.
Do we have any idea why or how they guarantee their own survival since they don't have this kind of added bonus of mycorrhizal association?
Yeah. So there's usually more than one way to skin a cat in nature, and Using mycorrhizal fungi, you might think would be kind of an odd way of doing it because this is a completely different organism you're allowing to colonize your roots. But it seems to work, and a lot of plants use them. But for those that don't, for example, the mustards, and another group is the Proteaceae. This is mostly an Australasian family. They have figured out through evolution a different way of acquiring phosphorus from soils that don't easily liberate phosphorus. And the mustards, for example, will, when they become phosphorus deficient, they'll secrete protons, and by doing that, they'll decrease the pH of the soil. And when you decrease the pH of the soil, certain kinds of soils, particularly those that have calcium phosphates, those will give up some phosphate. The phosphate will be solubilized, and the roots can take them up that way. Okay. So there are different ways of doing it.
And you also commented on potting soil, the soilless mixes, that they have absolutely no mycorrhizal associations at all. There's no mycorrhizal fungi in there.
Yeah, that's right. There is a company, Premier Peat Moss, that company. They have an arm of Premier called Premier Tech, and they do sell a product, potting soil with mycorrhizal fungi in it. And that's a good company, and they're legit, and they're not just trying to make money by selling a gimmicky product. But I will say, in that circumstance, in potting soils, it's not like soil in the sense that the reason why it's difficult to get phosphate out of soil is because the clay particles in the soil, they adhere to the surfaces of the clays adhere to the phosphate ions in the soil and don't liberate them very readily. And as a consequence, it's difficult to get phosphate out of real soil, and mycorrhizal fungi are of great benefit. In a potting mix, you don't have these clays, and the phosphate is not held strongly, not held tightly, and it's easy to get phosphate out of those things, out of potting mixes. So under those circumstances, it's not really all that essential to be mycorrhizal.
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that you're hitting on here is the living nature of soil and things within it. And you mentioned that when you buy these little packets of mycorrhizal fungi, they're not going to live too long in there because they're living things.
They are, and certain fungi, of course, are much more susceptible to dying in the package than others. Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, the spores anyway, are fairly robust, and they can be dehydrated and last for a while, but most ectomycorrhizal fungi don't last very, very long that way.
And moisture is a key here, correct? That dry soil is basically going to kill, or dry situation is going to kill mycorrhizal fungi after a certain period of time.
Well, not the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay.
The spores of the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi tend to be pretty robust with respect to drying. Okay. And in fact, that's the way we keep inoculum in the laboratory. We'll dry our pots down and just keep the soil from the pots. We can keep it for a year or so that way. But ectomycorrhizal fungi, they don't last that long.
Okay. So that's all right. And you also mentioned that compost doesn't have any mycorrhizal fungi, I guess because of the heat within it. Is that correct?
Well, compost won't have mycorrhizal fungi in it, even if you added mycorrhizal fungi, because of the heat that's produced during composting. But, of course, the materials that are used for composting, all the organic stuff, your coffee grounds, and all the rest of the stuff you put in there, is not going to have any mycorrhizal fungi. If you throw some dirt in there during composting, and a lot of people do to add the microbes from the soil, you may be adding some mycorrhizal fungi, but in the process of composting and the heating and all the rest of that, they're probably not all that abundant in there.
Okay. Yeah. So it sounds like the takeaway is that we're really best off by trying to utilize the naturally occurring mycorrhizal fungi that exist in our soil, and hopefully promote the conditions that encourage that, and by and large stay away from commercial products which are expensive and mostly fertilizer. Would that be a good summation?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay. And finally, I understand that you've been doing some research on biochar, which is a really hot topic, has been recently. Could you talk a little bit about your research with that?
Yeah, so one of the reasons why people are interested in biochar is that it's very, very recalcitrant. That is, it doesn't decompose. And one thing you can do with biochar is add it to soil, and it'll stay there for quite a long time. And in the process, you're what we call sequestering carbon. And that's carbon that comes out of the atmosphere because plants are taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and in photosynthesis turning it into carbohydrate. And if you then turn that into char, it's stable and it stays on the ground and doesn't go back in the atmosphere. So that's why there's a lot of interest in it. We're interested in biochar from a slightly different angle, and that is from the bioenergy crop angle, and we're interested in particular in a switchgrass system. So switchgrass is one of those potential bioenergy crops that can be used to produce fuel or energy of some kind. And if we're going to be growing bioenergy crops, we can't be using vast tracts of land that would otherwise be used for food crops. That would drive up food prices and so forth. So if we're going to grow these bioenergy crops like switchgrass, they're going to have to go on marginal lands that are not normally used for food crops. And the problem with marginal lands is that they're marginal. Growing anything there, even switchgrass, can be difficult. So the hypothesis we had was that we could better grow switchgrass on marginal lands if we improve those soils. And one possible way to improve those soils, whether they're too wet or too dry, might be to add biochar. So we're adding biochar to various marginal soils to see if this improves the growth of the bioenergy crop.
And have you published on this yet, or is this still in the works?
Yeah, it's a 5-year project. We're just finishing up the 3rd year, and we have a couple of publications, but not on they were laboratory publications, laboratory-based publications, and the field research has yet to be written up.
And if folks are interested in taking a look at some of your publications on mycorrhizal fungi, are they on the Brigham Young site in terms of your CV? Where can they best find this?
Yeah, if you go to the Brigham Young website and type in Roger Koide, you should come up with a web page of ours, and my CV is listed in past publications, and you can look them up that way.
And that's Koide, K-O-I-D-E.
Roger Koide.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Roger. It's been absolutely fascinating learning more about this. It's a complex topic, but something that we need to understand, so we do use best practices in the garden. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your research, and hope you'll speak with us again.
You're welcome, Kim. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.